Welcome back everyone. Today we're stepping into one of the darkest and most unsettling mysteries buried deep in the history of Louisiana. In 1849 there was a young girl on a remote plantation who became the most feared figure anyone had ever encountered. 22 women disappeared one by one, and at the center of every whispered rumor, every terrified glance, and every unexplained moment stood a silent girl who never spoke a single word. This is a story stitched together from forgotten records, old testimonies, and hidden accounts that took hours to uncover. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you sub. The mysterious arrival of the girl on the plantation in 1849 sent a ripple of unease through everyone who saw her. She appeared early one morning carried in a small battered wagon with no family and no belongings and no one to speak for her. Some of the older workers whispered she had been found wandering near the river alone, while others claimed she had been traded in secret from another estate, but no one knew for certain. The overseer who brought her said little about her past and avoided answering questions, yet even he kept his distance, as if sensing something strange about her presence that he could not explain. From the moment she stepped down onto the soft Louisiana earth, her presence felt different from any other child on the plantation. She did not cry when the sun beat down or when the wagons rattled on the dirt paths. She did not smile or show curiosity, but instead watched everything with dark, unwavering eyes that seemed far too knowing for her age. The older women on the plantation noticed immediately how she moved silently among the workers, and animals seemed to instinctively step aside when she approached. Her stillness and quiet made the air around her feel colder and heavier, and even those who tried to be brave felt an instinctive caution whenever she was near. Within hours of her arrival, the workers began to notice subtle changes in the plantation. Tools would be misplaced, and no one could say why. Animals acted skittish, as if sensing a presence no one could see. Even the youngest children, who normally played freely, avoided being near her and kept their distance in ways that felt almost automatic. The women exchanged worried glances and whispered to one another that something about this girl was unnatural. She seemed to observe without speaking, absorbing everything around her and yet revealing nothing about herself, leaving everyone unsettled and full of questions they dared not voice aloud. By the end of the first day, the plantation had been touched by an unspoken tension that no one could ignore. Everyone felt it in the air, in the way the sun seemed dimmer around her, in the quiet hush that followed her movements. She moved through the rows of work silently, leaving people uneasy and unsure of what to expect next. Something about her presence suggested that she was not just another child to care for, but a figure whose arrival would change the plantation forever and cast a shadow over everyone who crossed her path. Scribe, because every story here takes real research and real time to bring to life. From the very beginning it became clear that the women on the plantation sensed something unusual about the girl. She did not speak or interact in any way that was familiar, yet her presence alone caused tension among those who worked the fields and cared for the household. The older women whispered to one another when she passed by, noting how their hearts seemed to tighten and how they instinctively stepped aside as if acknowledging some invisible power. Even the youngest of the women, who had never experienced fear before, found themselves avoiding eye contact and feeling a shiver whenever she was near. The silence she carried was not ordinary silence, it was the kind that made the air feel heavier and every sound around her seem muted and tense. As the days passed, the fear among the women grew more pronounced. They began noticing small but troubling patterns in her behavior that seemed to coincide with misfortune and accidents around the plantation. Clothes would go missing, tools would break inexplicably, and the women would find themselves alone in rooms where shadows seemed to move unnaturally. Some whispered that she could sense what they were thinking before they even spoke, while others were too afraid to voice what they suspected. Regardless of the explanation, everyone agreed that when she was present things felt unpredictable, dangerous, and charged with a tension no one wanted to confront. The women also started observing her interactions with the environment in ways that made them uneasy. She would move silently through the quarters, pausing occasionally to watch others without touching or speaking. Animals reacted differently to her presence. Cats hissed, dogs barked, and even horses backed away as if acknowledging a threat that humans could not see. The women who cared for the livestock began to whisper that her presence alone could change the behavior of the animals, and they learned to keep a careful distance when she was near. Her stillness and her focus gave her a presence that felt unnatural and impossible to ignore. Rumors began circulating quietly among the women about what she might be capable of. Some claimed she could manipulate events without raising a hand, while others feared she could harm without intent or warning. Every whispered story heightened the fear and the sense of dread on the plantation. Even the bravest women found themselves double-checking their surroundings and hesitating before passing by her quarters. The tension she inspired was not limited to one person. It spread through the group, silently building an unspoken consensus that she was not like any child they had ever encountered. By the end of the first weeks on the plantation, it became impossible for the women to ignore the danger they felt in her presence. Their work slowed when she was near, and they made excuses to avoid interaction. Some refused to go into the same rooms as her, others kept their distance in the fields. The fear was palpable and shared. It connected them in a silent understanding that the girl carried a force no one could name or predict. Her presence had shifted the balance on the plantation, creating an environment of tension and anxiety that would continue to grow with each passing day. The first disappearance sent a shockwave through the plantation and confirmed the worst fears of everyone who had sensed the girl's strange presence. It began quietly one morning when a woman who had been working in the cotton fields failed to return to the quarters at the usual time. At first the overseer assumed she had gone to tend to another task or perhaps visited a neighbor nearby, but as hours passed it became clear that something was wrong. The other women grew uneasy and began searching the plantation, calling her name, but there was no response and no sign of where she had gone. By nightfall the absence was undeniable, and whispers began spreading like wildfire among the enslaved community about the girl who had arrived months earlier and the danger she seemed to carry with her. The women who had seen her around the quarters recalled her standing silently in corners, observing everything yet never participating in conversation or work. Now their unease turned into terror because the missing woman had last been seen near the girl and the timing could not be ignored. No one wanted to accuse her openly, yet everyone felt an instinctive connection between the girl's silent presence and the woman's sudden disappearance. The older women held secret meetings in their cabins, whispering theories and recounting small incidents they had dismissed as coincidence before but now realized might have been warnings. The fear was no longer abstract, it had become real, tangible, and impossible to ignore. As the plantation workers continued their search, they noticed other small oddities that deepened their dread. Belongings of the missing woman were found scattered in strange places, sometimes near the quarters, sometimes along pathways where she would not normally have been alone. There were no signs of struggle or blood, only a sense of sudden absence and eerie stillness around the areas she had been last seen. Even the men who were tasked with maintaining the fields admitted a strange chill whenever they walked past certain spots, as if the land itself had shifted in response to her disappearance. Every observation seemed to point toward the girl, yet no one could articulate exactly what had happened or how she could have caused it to be. By the end of the first day, the plantation was gripped by a tense and fearful silence. Work slowed as everyone glanced constantly toward the girl, who remained in her usual place, quiet, still, and watching as if she knew everything that had occurred. The women who had feared her from the beginning now whispered openly among themselves, sharing the same unspoken realization that she was at the center of the plantation's first disappearance. The atmosphere was heavy with fear and suspicion, and the balance of life on the plantation had shifted irrevocably. From that moment onward, no one could see her as just another child, and everyone understood that her presence carried consequences far beyond ordinary understanding. As the nights fell over the plantation, the girl's behavior began to grow even more unsettling, and the women noticed patterns that chilled them to the bone. She would move silently through the quarters after everyone had gone to bed, and sometimes stand in the shadows observing the sleeping women without making a sound. No one knew how long she stayed in one place or what she was doing, and the eerie stillness she maintained made those who glimpsed her feel as if the air itself had changed. The quiet of the night seemed to bend around her, and every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside felt amplified, as if the plantation were holding its breath in her presence. The enslaved women began sharing stories in whispers about what they had seen in the dark. Some claimed she would appear suddenly at the edge of the firelight or crouched in corners watching with eyes that reflected no emotion but a deep, penetrating focus. Others spoke of shadows moving unnaturally around her, or of faint sounds that followed her like echoes of footsteps that belonged to no one. No matter who saw her or when these events occurred, everyone agreed that the girl seemed connected to something beyond the ordinary that could not be explained by natural means. Rumors spread that she communicated without words, and that her presence alone could influence the behavior of others in the dark. Women who had slept in the same cabins reported waking to find objects shifted or missing, and animals acting wildly as if they sensed an unseen force. Some whispered that she could manipulate the environment itself, making doors creak open and windows rattle as she passed. Fear built silently yet relentlessly, because each observation confirmed the growing suspicion that she was not just a child, she was a force that carried power the women could feel but could not name. By the end of several weeks, the nighttime behavior of the girl had become a source of constant dread. The women no longer felt safe even in their own quarters, and many altered their routines to avoid encountering her after sunset. Sleep became uneasy and filled with the sense of being watched, while the plantation itself felt heavier and darker in ways that could not be attributed to ordinary nightfall. Her silent movements had turned the nights into a realm of tension and fear, and everyone who had witnessed them understood that the danger she represented was real and inescapable. Hidden corners of the plantation soon became places of fear and suspicion, as the missing women were believed to have been drawn there or left traces behind that no one could explain. Certain sheds near the back of the fields were avoided by everyone because small personal belongings of the disappeared women were found scattered there in ways that made no sense. Shoes, hats, and scraps of clothing appeared in neat but unexplainable arrangements, and the women whispered that it was as if someone had intentionally placed them to send a message. The air in these areas felt heavier and colder than the surrounding fields, and anyone who ventured too close reported a sensation of being watched even when no one was visible. The kitchens and storage areas also held secrets that unsettled the workers. Utensils were found moved from their usual places, sometimes laid out on the floor in strange formations, and containers opened and closed without explanation. Women who cooked and cleaned in the early mornings began noticing subtle signs that something had occurred overnight. Some of the missing women's personal effects appeared in the corners of rooms or tucked behind barrels in ways that suggested deliberate placement. Fear began to grow because the pattern of discovery seemed to point directly to the girl who never spoke but who was always present when these oddities were found. The quarters where the women slept became another source of dread. Blankets were shifted from their usual folds, small items went missing, and some women claimed to see fleeting shadows near the corners of the room late at night. The girl's silent presence was reported by several witnesses to coincide with these disturbances, and although no one could explain how it happened, the association was undeniable. Every hidden nook and shadowed corner seemed to hold an air of mystery that amplified the growing fear among the women and reinforced the belief that these spaces were linked to the disappearances. Even the fields themselves were not safe from suspicion. Workers noticed small clusters of objects laid out along pathways or under trees in patterns that appeared intentional. Sometimes it was just a few personal belongings of the missing women, and other times small arrangements of sticks, stones, or clothing appeared as if marking specific spots. The women began walking in groups, avoiding these areas whenever possible and whispering about the girls' possible role in guiding or influencing what occurred. The pattern was consistent and unmistakable, suggesting a knowledge of the land and its hidden corners that went far beyond ordinary understanding. By the end of several months, the hidden locations on the plantation were no longer just places where work was done or items stored. They had become symbols of fear and warning, and everyone understood that they were connected to the missing women and the silent girl. Even those who had initially doubted the stories began avoiding these spaces and telling one another that they were places to be treated with caution and respect. The plantation itself seemed transformed by these hidden areas, becoming a labyrinth of dread where every corner might hold a clue or a threat that no one could predict. Rumors about the girl's silent influence spread quickly through the enslaved community, and everyone seemed to know a version of the story even if they had not seen it themselves. Women whispered in hushed tones about how she could make people act without touching them or speaking, and how her presence alone could change the course of a conversation or a task. They said she watched quietly and that her gaze seemed to follow thoughts, as if she could see intentions and fears before they were voiced. Even the bravest workers admitted that her silence carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore, and that being near her often brought a sense of unease that could not be shaken. Many of the women described subtle events that convinced them she had some power over what happened around her. Tools would break mysteriously or fall from shelves when she was nearby, and small accidents seemed to occur only when she was in the vicinity. Some claimed to feel sudden chills or a tightening in their chest as she passed, a physical sensation that made them instinctively step back. The fear grew not because of anything she said or did openly, but because of the undeniable patterns that kept repeating whenever she was present among them. The rumors also told of moments when the girl's influence was nearly undeniable. Women would see shadows move unnaturally in her direction or hear whispers that had no source while she remained perfectly still. Objects that were carefully placed would end up in entirely different locations, and no one could explain how it happened. These occurrences spread through the enslaved community, creating a network of stories that reinforced the idea that she was connected to every strange and frightening event that took place on the plantation. As these stories circulated, the women began to rely on each other for guidance and protection. They learned to observe her movements and to avoid her presence whenever possible, and they shared warnings quietly among themselves. Even those who tried to rationalize the events admitted that she seemed to exert a strange influence that could not be ignored. The fear became collective and almost tangible, a shared understanding that she was unlike any child they had ever known, and that her silent power was something that touched every corner of the plantation. By the end of weeks and months, the belief in her influence had become deeply rooted in the community. The women treated her with a mixture of fear and caution, and every encounter reinforced the idea that she was at the center of the plantation's growing unease. No one could explain how she achieved it, and no one dared confront her directly. Her presence had transformed the everyday life of the enslaved community into a careful navigation of silent power and unspoken rules that kept everyone alert and constantly aware of her watching eyes. The overseer's refusal to take the warnings seriously only made the situation on the plantation far more tense and dangerous. From the very beginning, the women approached him with quiet but urgent accounts of the girl's strange behavior and the growing fear that something was wrong. They spoke of disappearing women, of objects moving without explanation, and of the oppressive feeling that accompanied her presence, yet the overseer dismissed their concerns as imagination or overreaction. He claimed the girl was just a child and that they were reading too much into ordinary events, failing to understand that the pattern of unease and fear had already taken root among those who worked most closely with her. Despite repeated incidents, he refused to conduct any investigation or intervene in ways that might reveal the truth. When questioned about missing items or accidents, he brushed them aside and sometimes even chastised the women for speaking openly about their fears. His words carried authority, yet his eyes revealed a mixture of unease and frustration, as if he could sense something amiss but lacked the courage or understanding to confront it directly. This dismissal left the women feeling isolated and forced them to rely on one another for support and protection instead of seeking help from those in charge. The overseer's attitude created an environment where fear and suspicion thrived unchecked. Without oversight or intervention, the women grew more cautious in their movements, avoiding certain areas of the plantation and keeping constant watch over the girl while she continued to move silently among them. The lack of acknowledgement of the danger meant that incidents could continue without consequence, and each day the women became more convinced that the girl's influence was growing stronger. They whispered privately about what they suspected while outwardly maintaining obedience and routine so as not to attract punishment or attention from the authority figure who refused to act. Over time, the overseer himself began to notice that his dismissal was having consequences. Animals became skittish, tools went missing, and the workers seemed tense in ways he could not control. Although he still publicly denied the seriousness of the situation, he increasingly kept his distance from the girl and avoided confronting her directly. His refusal to investigate created a vacuum of authority that allowed the fear and suspicion surrounding her to flourish and left the women with no choice but to navigate the growing danger on their own. The plantation itself became a place where silence and caution dominated, and where the overseer's inability to act only heightened the sense of impending dread that followed the girl wherever she went. Strange occurrences involving animals avoiding her became another layer of fear that spread quietly through the plantation. From the moment she arrived, horses refused to be led near her and shied away with sudden movements that made the workers uneasy. Dogs growled or barked when she passed, though she never touched them, and cats would hiss or retreat into corners as if sensing a presence invisible to the human eye. Even birds seemed to react strangely, landing elsewhere or flying away at her approach, and the women who cared for the animals whispered among themselves that she carried a power that no one could understand or explain. These reactions were not limited to isolated moments but seemed to follow a consistent pattern across the plantation. Whenever the girl entered the stables or barns, the animals grew restless and the workers quickly learned to give her space. Chickens would scatter suddenly and goats would refuse to move as though frozen by an unseen force. The women noticed that even small creatures like mice or insects seemed to avoid areas she occupied, leaving the spaces around her strangely quiet. These patterns strengthened the belief that she exerted an influence over her surroundings without lifting a hand or speaking a word. The women began connecting these animal behaviors to the mysterious disappearances and other unsettling incidents that had occurred since her arrival. They whispered that if animals could sense danger in her presence, then surely humans were equally vulnerable. Even those who had previously doubted the rumors felt a growing unease as the patterns became undeniable. Fear became layered and persistent because it was not only about what she did to people but also about the way the world around her seemed to bend in response to her silent will. Over time, the fear of her influence on animals became a tool of survival for the women. They learned to watch her closely and adjust their movements to avoid areas where animals reacted strangely. They would warn each other quietly when the girl approached fields or enclosures and took note of how the animals behaved as an early warning system. The consistent reactions of the creatures reinforced the sense that she was no ordinary child and that her presence carried a weight that altered the natural order of the plantation. It became increasingly clear that even the smallest living things recognized something terrifying in her and that the women needed to remain vigilant at all times. A chilling pattern began to emerge as the women and workers slowly connected the dots between the 22 disappearances and the silent girl. At first the events seemed random and isolated, but over time certain consistencies became impossible to ignore. The missing women had all been seen near her shortly before vanishing, and there were always subtle signs of disturbance in the places where they were last noticed. Items would be found out of place, footprints would appear in unusual locations, and the air would carry a strange tension that left witnesses uneasy and afraid. Each incident followed a similar rhythm, creating an unspoken connection that terrified those who recognized it. The pattern extended beyond physical evidence to timing and location. Disappearances often occurred at night or in secluded corners of the plantation when the girl had been observed standing silently nearby. Workers reported feeling a sudden drop in temperature or an unnatural stillness in the air in the moments leading up to an incident. The women whispered that the girl seemed to know where people were at all times and that her silent movements always preceded a misfortune. It was as if she was orchestrating events invisibly, leaving a trail of fear and mystery in her wake that no one could explain or challenge. The more the pattern became apparent, the more the women began to fear her, not only for what she might do but for what she represented. Each disappearance reinforced the sense that her presence was dangerous and inevitable. The enslaved workers began to change their routines, avoiding certain areas, moving in groups, and whispering warnings whenever she was near. It was clear that no one was safe alone and that the girl had a hold over the plantation that went far beyond ordinary childhood influence. Every incident fed into the next, creating a cycle of dread that became impossible to escape. By the time nearly half of the 22 women had vanished, the pattern was undeniable. Everyone who had witnessed her presence knew the connection, yet no one could stop it or confront her directly. Fear became a constant companion as people tried to anticipate where she might be and who might be next. The silent girl had woven herself into the very fabric of the plantation, creating a network of tension, terror, and unspoken rules. Her influence was subtle yet absolute, and the realization that she was at the center of every disappearance left the women paralyzed with dread, knowing that nothing about her or the events unfolding could be understood or controlled. A woman who had narrowly escaped the silent girl's presence provided testimony that would send shivers through the entire plantation and confirm fears that had been quietly building for months. She described a moment late one afternoon when she had been alone in the quarters sorting clothing and preparing meals while the girl stood silently in the doorway observing her every move. At first the girl said nothing and made no sudden movements, but the witness recalled a weight in the air, a pressure that seemed to press against her chest and slow her breathing. It was as if the entire room had shifted, and the girl's gaze alone communicated a force that was impossible to describe yet impossible to ignore. The woman recounted that objects began to move in subtle ways as she worked. Utensils slid across tables, scraps of cloth shifted on their own, and small tools tipped over without anyone touching them. She froze in fear, certain that the girl had caused the disturbances even though she remained perfectly still. Every instinct screamed that she needed to leave the room, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She whispered prayers quietly under her breath and tried to focus on breathing normally while the girl continued to watch, unblinking and utterly silent. The sense of danger was palpable, and even after the object stopped moving, the oppressive feeling lingered in the room for hours. Eventually the witness recounted that she managed to escape the room under the cover of night when the girl moved to another corner of the quarters. She fled through the fields in darkness, barely daring to look back, and hid until dawn in the farthest edge of the plantation. When she returned in the morning, the other women listened in stunned silence as she described how the girl had not spoken, had not touched her, and yet had nearly driven her into a state of panic. The experience cemented the belief that the girl's power was not physical but psychological, a silent control over perception and environment that left the women powerless and terrified. Her testimony quickly spread among the enslaved community, whispered from one cabin to the next, reinforcing the idea that the girl was far more than an ordinary child. Each retelling added to the sense of inevitability and dread, confirming what many already suspected, that anyone who crossed her path alone was in danger. The story of her escape became a warning, a map of caution for others to follow, and further proof that the silent girl's influence was absolute. Fear had taken root so deeply that every woman who heard the account changed her behavior, avoiding her presence whenever possible and treating the plantation as a labyrinth of threat where one wrong step could have deadly consequences. The night the plantation nearly uncovered the truth became one of the most terrifying experiences the women had ever faced and left an impression that would last for generations. It began when a group of workers noticed unusual movements near the main house just after sunset. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls and a faint hum, almost like whispered chants, carried through the air. The women hesitated, clutching one another and silently warning each other to stay calm, but their fear was unmistakable. The girl was present as always, standing perfectly still in the corner of the yard, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering lanterns and watching every movement without speaking. As the night progressed, the sense of dread intensified. Objects seemed to move on their own, doors creaked open and shut without any wind, and small fires in lanterns flickered as if something unseen was passing between them. The women could hear their own heartbeats and the scurrying of animals that were also unsettled by her presence. Some claimed to see fleeting glimpses of the missing women in the shadows, only to realize moments later that they were not really there. Every detail reinforced the terrifying possibility that the silent girl had orchestrated something far beyond ordinary understanding. In the panic and confusion, a few of the bravest women tried to approach her, hoping to confront or understand what was happening. Each step closer seemed to make the air heavier, almost suffocating, and their courage faltered as inexplicable noises and sudden movements made them jump back. The girl did not move or speak, yet her influence was undeniable. The plantation itself felt alive with tension and fear, as if it were a participant in the events rather than a mere backdrop. Those present realized with growing horror that they were on the edge of discovering the full extent of her power, but they were powerless to stop. By the end of the night, the group had scattered, retreating to the safety of their cabins, hearts pounding and bodies trembling. No one dared speak of what had truly happened in detail, but the terror remained etched in their memories. Even the men who had been skeptical could not deny the strange occurrences and subtle signs of influence that had taken place. The night marked a turning point. It was the moment when the women understood that the silent girl was not simply a presence to fear but a force that controlled the very atmosphere of the plantation. The sense of danger had grown permanent, and the realization that the full truth might never be uncovered added a lingering shadow over everyone who lived there. The girl's sudden disappearance from the plantation left everyone in a state of shock and lingering fear that nothing could erase. One morning she was simply gone, her usual silent presence no longer felt in the quarters, the fields, or the hidden corners where she had been observed. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no belongings left behind, and no explanation offered by the overseer or anyone else. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving the entire plantation suspended in disbelief and terror. The women who had lived in constant dread of her influence felt both relief and an unshakable unease, knowing that her absence did not mean safety, only that the unknown had withdrawn for the moment. Immediately, speculation ran rampant across the plantation and the surrounding area. Some believed she had been taken away by someone from another property, while others whispered darker possibilities that she had been spirited away by forces beyond human understanding. The suddenness of her disappearance mirrored the silence she had always maintained, leaving no trace and no clue as to where she had gone or what she might do next. Even those who had previously doubted her power could not ignore the eerie timing and the fact that every disappearance and strange event had ceased with her absence. Her leaving did not answer questions, it only deepened the mysteries surrounding her presence. The women who had survived her proximity struggled with the emotional aftermath of her departure. They had been conditioned to live cautiously, to avoid certain areas, to watch her movements, and to warn one another constantly. Now without her visible presence the tension remained, embedded in every shadowed corner and every creaking floorboard. The memories of her silent influence were as tangible as her absence and served as a constant reminder of what could have happened to those who vanished. Fear lingered like a shadow that no one could fully escape, leaving the community hyper-aware of every sound and movement around them. In the months and years that followed, the plantation never returned to normal. The women continued to whisper her name in private, recounting stories of objects moving on their own, shadows behaving strangely, and the oppressive weight she carried without a single word. Even the overseer who had once dismissed their fears began to acknowledge in private that her presence had been far from ordinary. The legacy of her disappearance endured, not as relief but as an ongoing, haunting question. Where had she gone? Had she returned to claim more victims? Or had the plantation simply been marked forever by the shadow of the most feared girl who had ever walked its grounds? The answers remained unknown, and the fear she inspired endured for generations. The legend of the silent girl continued to haunt the plantation long after her disappearance and became a story passed down through whispered conversations and cautious warnings. Even though she was no longer seen, her presence lingered in the memories of the women who had lived under her watchful gaze and in the hidden corners of the plantation where unexplained events had occurred. Visitors and new workers often reported feeling an unexplainable chill or a sense of being watched in the area she had once frequented, and the older women would quietly tell them to leave those places alone. The plantation itself seemed to retain a memory of her, as if the very land had absorbed the fear and tension that had surrounded her, creating an atmosphere that remained heavy and oppressive for decades. Stories of the girl spread beyond the plantation to neighboring properties and towns where people spoke in hushed tones about the child who had been capable of terrifying the entire estate without uttering a word. Some claimed to have seen fleeting shadows in the distance or noticed strange disturbances that mirrored the events reported during her time on the plantation. The tale took on almost mythic proportions with each retelling, blending fact and fear into a cautionary narrative that warned others of the power that one individual could hold over those who underestimated her. The community learned to respect silence and stillness in ways that reflected the influence she had once exerted. Even generations later, the story remained embedded in local folklore, taught to children as a warning and recounted by adults with a mix of reverence and fear. Researchers and historians who attempted to piece together the truth from scattered records and testimonies often found themselves unsettled by the same unease that had gripped the original witnesses. They noted that although the girl had vanished, her legacy was tangible in the patterns of fear, the hidden locations, and the accounts of those who had survived. The plantation became a symbol not only of her deeds but of the psychological and almost supernatural impact she had wielded through silence and presence alone. the enduring nature of her story ensured that the silent girl was never forgotten. People spoke of her cautiously, and even those who had never lived on the plantation instinctively felt a shiver at the mention of her name. The legend served as a reminder that some histories carry shadows that cannot be erased, that fear can be inherited, and that some individuals leave marks on the world that survive long after they are gone. Her influence persisted not in physical form but in the stories, the warnings, and the collective memory of those who had felt the weight of her presence. The plantation, the land, and the community remained forever tied to the memory of the most feared girl who had walked silently among them, a haunting figure whose story continues to terrify and intrigue to this day. The aftermath of the silent girl's reign of terror continued to ripple through the lives of everyone connected to the plantation long after she vanished. Families spoke in hushed tones about the women who had disappeared, and the fear that had gripped the community became woven into the very fabric of daily life. Children grew up hearing warnings not to wander alone near certain parts of the property, and even visitors felt the weight of stories passed down through generations. The plantation itself became a place of caution and superstition, where shadows were mistrusted and silence was treated as an omen rather than a simple absence of sound. The memory of the girl influenced the behaviors and routines of the remaining women and workers for decades. They avoided hidden corners and pathways where she had once been seen and made a habit of moving in groups to prevent another unexplained disappearance. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle in the trees was met with heightened attention and whispered speculation, and the lessons learned from living in constant fear shaped how the community interacted with one another. Even mundane tasks were approached with caution, as though the threat she represented had left an invisible mark on the land itself. Stories of her power and the 22 missing women became part of the collective identity of the area. The legend was recounted with a mixture of horror and awe, often exaggerated in small details yet anchored in the terrifying truth of what had occurred. Travelers passing through the region were warned about the plantation and the girl whose silence could unsettle anyone. The tale took on a mythic quality, blending history with the supernatural, and the boundary between what had happened and what could have been imagined blurred with every retelling. This created a persistent tension in the community that lasted far longer than the girl's physical presence. Even today, the legacy of the silent girl serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked fear and the power of presence over action. Her story is a cautionary tale, not only about the events that occurred on the plantation but also about the psychological weight carried by those who survive trauma and witness inexplicable events. The fear she inspired has been inherited in stories, behaviors, and cultural memory, ensuring that her influence, though silent and unseen, continues to echo through time. The plantation and its surrounding lands remain forever tied to her legend, a haunting reminder that some figures leave impressions on the world that are impossible to erase and that terror can endure far beyond the life of the one who first inspired it. Even decades after the girl's disappearance, the impact of her presence lingered in subtle and unsettling ways across the plantation and the surrounding community. Those who had survived her silent reign of terror often spoke in hushed tones of moments when they felt her presence despite knowing she was long gone. A sudden chill in the air, a shadow moving at the edge of vision, or an inexplicable unease in rooms she had once occupied reminded them that the fear she inspired was not easily forgotten. The land itself seemed to carry the memory of her influence, as if every creaking floorboard, every rustling tree, and every hidden corner retained a trace of the tension and dread she had created. Visitors to the plantation often reported sensations of being watched or feeling compelled to leave certain areas even when they had no knowledge of the girl or her history. Stories spread beyond the immediate community and became part of local lore, with details exaggerated or colored by fear yet rooted in the truth of her impact. People who had never met her learned to approach the property with caution, and the legend grew, taking on an almost supernatural weight. Every whispered account reinforced the notion that she had left behind more than fear. She had left a presence that could still be sensed and that commanded respect even in her absence. The women who had worked and lived on the plantation carried the lessons of her influence into their daily lives, teaching younger generations to be wary of silence and stillness in unexpected places. Practices and habits developed out of necessity, such as moving in groups, avoiding certain areas, and watching one another for signs of danger, became ingrained over time. These behaviors shaped the culture of the community and ensured that the story of the silent girl was not just remembered but actively preserved as a living memory. Fear became both a survival tool and a shared understanding that linked everyone who had experienced or heard of her presence. Over the years, her story transformed into a cautionary legend, a tale told with reverence and fear that emphasized the power of silence and observation. People spoke of her ability to dominate spaces without a word and to influence events through mere presence, turning her into a symbol of both terror and mystery. The plantation and its hidden corners became a place where the echoes of her actions could still be felt, and the psychological impact of her existence persisted in subtle ways across time. Her legacy endured not through physical acts but through the lingering sense of dread and the cultural memory of a girl whose silence and watchfulness had forever changed the lives of everyone she touched. The psychological impact of the silent girl on those who remained at the plantation extended far beyond her disappearance and shaped the mental landscape of the community for generations. Women and workers who had witnessed her presence lived with a constant undercurrent of fear and unease that never fully dissipated. They would wake in the night startled by imagined movements or shadows that reminded them of her, feeling the same weight in the air they had felt when she had been there. Even years later, stories of her silent influence dominated conversations and private reflections, creating a sense that the plantation itself had been forever altered by her presence. This pervasive fear also affected the relationships between the people who survived her era. Trust became cautious and measured as individuals worried not only about the unexplained events but about the unpredictability of human behavior under the shadow of her legend. The women who had seen her closest shared warnings and secret signals with one another, creating an unspoken network of vigilance that extended through the plantation and into neighboring areas. The psychological imprint of her presence fostered both dependence and paranoia, as people learned to rely on each other for guidance while simultaneously fearing what they could not control. The legend of her silent power became a teaching tool for new generations, embedding lessons about awareness, caution, and respect for the unknown. Children grew up hearing stories of her ability to manipulate spaces, influence events, and inspire fear without a single word, and they internalized these tales as warnings. Even those who had never directly encountered her learned to approach the plantation and its surroundings with care, carrying forward the behavioral patterns established by those who had lived in her presence. The psychological influence became a form of cultural memory, transmitted not only through words but through practiced vigilance and deeply ingrained habits. Over time, the community recognized that her silence had created more than fear, it had reshaped the very way people experienced their world. Every shadowed corner, every creaking floorboard, and every hidden path became a locus of attention and caution, a reminder of her unseen yet undeniable influence. People adapted to live in a state of heightened awareness, and the psychological legacy of the silent girl became inseparable from the physical space of the plantation. Her impact was not measured in words or deeds but in the enduring tension, vigilance, and quiet terror that lingered long after she had vanished, a testament to the power of presence over action and the deep, lasting effects of a force that could not be seen but could always be felt.